Good morning. I'm Bob Shrum, the Warsaw Chair in Politics and the Director of the Unruh Institute of Politics here at the University of Southern California. Nearly 80 years ago, Franklin Roosevelt addressed the daughters of the American Revolution as fellow immigrants and reminded them that all of us, you and I, are descended from immigrants. They did not applaud the line. Migration and immigration have been contentious issues in this country for generations. And now with the refugee crisis and the impact of globalization, Europe has experienced a rising tide of migrants, and the backlash has been felt in politics there as well as in the United States. That's the focus of our conference today, which has brought some extraordinary leaders, scholars, and commentators to USC. To welcome you formally, let me introduce someone whose work and reach touch nearly every part of this campus, our Provost, Michael Quick. He also leavens the university with a rare kind of dry and self-deprecating wit. At his installation as provost, he recalled something his parents used to say to him. Michael, listen, you have been given a tremendous privilege by having half a brain. You never use it. Well, ever since he has used it, and the truth is he has far more than half a brain. Ladies and gentlemen, Provost Michael Quick.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Oh my goodness. Good morning, everyone. Great to see you all. Thanks for coming. I want to give a big shout out to Bob and the Unruh Institute for hosting this, and to Jake Soll for helping to organize it. He'll be up here right after me. Very, very pleased to have you all here to talk about this incredibly important issue. I became provost 3 years ago. It only feels like 21. And one of the things I talked about in that installation speech was that we are a big university here at the University of Southern California. We're 7,000 faculty, 45,000 students. We have 19 schools here, 19 colleges, everything from medicine to 6 tremendous art schools. We need, in the 21st century, to be the university that tackles problems that require all 19 schools, all 7,000 faculty to be engaged with. I call them the wicked problems or the wicked challenges. These are the big problems of the 21st century. And so since that time, we've launched a number of big initiatives around homelessness, for example, which is, of course, a crucial issue here in Southern California. Lifespan health is another big challenge that we are taking on as we confront the idea that we can't afford illness anymore. We have to figure out a way to afford wellness, and that starts early on. And so what does that look like? We've been working on big issues around security, both cybersecurity, but also food and water security, and sort of the companion to that, issues of sustainability. But I can't imagine a bigger issue confronting the world right now in the 21st century than the one around how we deal with globalization, how we make the most of that opportunity, but the stress that it has put on the system around issues of migration and immigration. And certainly Los Angeles as a great migrant city, how do we deal with it? I know here on our campus, not only do we deal with DACA issues, we deal with a long-standing issue, for example, of the fact that we bring the best and the brightest from around the globe, and we train them, and then we send them back to their countries, which is great, but we don't have the option to keep them here and contributing to the talent of our universities here in the United States. And so on a day-to-day basis, I wrestle with this just as a provost, but how does the world take on this challenge and turn those challenges into opportunities? And so I'm so proud that this conference is taking place here on our campus, where we want to confront and have hard conversations about these issues. And so I wish you all a great day today, and I would like to bring up right now Professor Jake Soll, who has been at USC now for 5 years. He just this year was named university professor. I don't know what that means, but it sounds important. But nobody deserves it more than Jake. and just the kind of person we love here at USC. Somebody who both sits within our history department in our Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, as well as our School of Accounting. And it's the kind of appointment that we love to see take place here at the university, and shows the breadth not only of what we do at the university, but also of the tremendous faculty that we have. Without further ado, Professor Jake Soll.
Thanks, Michael, Provost, Quick. We are really trying, and with Michael's leadership, we are trying to bring these problems to USC and try and tackle them. And so I'm really excited that we're doing this, and it's a big day for us here. Commissioner Avramopoulos, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, thank you for coming today. I'd like to quickly thank Dornsife College for making this extraordinary event possible, and I'd also like to thank Bob Schrum and the UNRWA Institute. Without Bob's skill and vision, this would not have been possible both conceptually and organizationally. But I would particularly like to thank Professor Aristotle Tsampidis, together with whom we together first conceived of this conference, actually in Athens, as we witnessed the refugee crisis firsthand. A few blocks from his office, we could see not only the human tragedy unfolding in front of us, but also we were at the edge of the possible abyss of death and political instability to which the terrible logic of human suffering now leads. One of the things I've noticed in the United States is as we talk about refugee and migration crisis, it's become a bit dry. So I just wanted to make a couple points because I have to say I'm a little bit upset about this. The first thing I want to say is we shouldn't forget, and I'm just using this as a rhetorical example, that between 1933 and 1941, 340,000 Jews tried to flee Nazi Germany. 300,000 applied for asylum and entrance into the United States. Only 85,000 were allowed entrance. A boat of 9,000 arrived and was turned away and forced to return to Nazi Germany, where the passengers were murdered. I would think that we would all regret this today. In hindsight, it seems a mad and dark folly. And yet we do not face the changes right now, the challenges that we faced in the 1930s. And yet the United States struggled to admit 50,000 refugees in 2017. I got to tell you that I'm ashamed of this number. We all should be ashamed of this. And frankly, because racism and a banal and deadly political realism is to blame for sending thousands to misery and death. For many Americans, such as myself, this is personal. My great-grandfather was a refugee. My great-grandmother was a fancy refugee, still a refugee. My great-grandfather went through Liverpool, just like a lot of people coming to this country did. He was a famous scientist. Wasn't allowed to practice in this country because he was a Unitarian of Jewish descent. It's complicated. There was still clearly huge amounts of racism then, obviously even more. His son was a co-founder of Head Start. He founded a family. He did a lot. The question that stands in my mind today, first of all, how many Americans come from refugee families? And we can go all the way back to the 17th century for that one. But how many are we sending back to and condemning to death and misery in places like Syria, Sudan, Yemen, Myanmar, or Honduras? Something is deeply wrong when we fall behind the 1930s. Actually, we seem to be kind of catching up in other ways too. Think of what Greece, small, nearly bankrupt country, is confronting and dealing with an enormous crisis, which Greece has actually taken on. The United States has not even thought of confronting these issues in the way that Greece is. It is my hope that this conference can, in a small way, help us find some real solutions to these incredibly hard and continuing challenges, and to define the moral boundaries of what we still unfortunately call solutions. It's a bad word, okay? All that said, and particularly because of this, it is a great honor to introduce to you Commissioner Dimitris Avramopoulos, who is Commissioner for Migration, Home Affairs, and Citizenship at the European Commission in Brussels. He's the former mayor of Athens, where his work was universally acclaimed. He has been Foreign Minister of Greece, and we know him as a humanitarian, as a pragmatist, not afraid in today's polarized world to reach across political aisles, to get things done, to do the right thing and the courageous thing. He's on the front lines of what is post-war and post-Cold War Europe's greatest challenge. We are delighted and honored to have him here today at USC. Commissioner Avramopoulos, thank you and welcome.
More cooperation, more solidarity, more responsibility and unity. We all know that security is at the very top, not only of the European, but also of the global policy agenda. Today's security environment is volatile and unpredictable. The security of one member state of the Union is the security of all. We're talking about people. You, elegidos, y aisiοδοξίες. Talking about fences and barriers, one of the greatest achievements of the European integration. Believe me, I can tell you more of what you can see in the film. Dear all, believe me, it is an honor for me to be with you today to discuss one of the top issues of the global political agenda and a top concern of citizens both here in the United States and in Europe,
how to better manage migration in the 21st century. Let me start by telling you that when I was designated commissioner responsible for migration and homeland security, I could never imagine that in a very short period of only 5 months, these issues would be not on the top of the European, but of the global agenda. Some of my colleagues in the Commission said that I was the unlucky man. But between us, instead of living a boring life in Brussels, I prefer what I am doing and we have done a lot during these last 3 years. Definitely we are not where we were before. You all know that we live in the era of human mobility, of global human mobility. More than 65 million people today are displaced. It's a big number. And more than 250 million more generally on the move. Our world is becoming more mobile, more globalized, and more interconnected. At the same time, however, our societies are becoming more fractured and more inward-looking, as if we have learned nothing from our recent history. Less welcoming and more suspicious of those that may be different. We have had an international economic crisis on both sides of the Atlantic. But this has not shaken the cohesion of our societies. No, it took the migration crisis and the question of migration and refugees to divide us, to start tearing at our social fabric. We are unfortunately all too familiar with the rise of populist and nationalistic discourse and its impact in elections over the past years. Germany, France, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Italy most recently. Very worrying messages from the future of Europe. The migration issue has also been a very divisive issue here in the United States and still continues to be. We are confronted with similar challenges across the Atlantic. Europe and the United States have a long-standing historic partnership. A partnership that was built on common sacrifices, history, and shared values. The post-war international system, as we know it today, was built on those values. Openness, solidarity, responsibility, cooperation, and burden sharing. A commitment to uphold rules and norms on the basis of which we build international institutions to prevent backsliding to the darkness of our past. Despite the many things that are written or said in the media today about the relationship, we continue to be very much alike in the essence of our principles, in the fundaments of our democracies, and in the aspirations of our choices. Whether in Europe or here in the United States, our citizens long for the same things: They want institutions that protect, that ensure security, but also openness and tolerance, economic opportunities and freedom. During the last 3 years, this balance is precisely what we have been trying to ensure and uphold in Europe. To guarantee mobility and freedom, openness and tolerance, but not at the cost of our security and safety. The European Union, believe me, is a union of values which we want to uphold and protect. But in the midst of two parallel crises on migration and security, our actions had to become much more hands-on and operational. The major paradigm shift here was that this hands-on approach was not some kind of power grab from Brussels. It was a direct request, a direct demand of our member states. This is why strengthening and better managing our external borders, which was not the case before, has been a key priority for all of us. Strong and secure external borders are paramount to ensure, first of all, our internal security, to fight irregular migration, and to safeguard our internal mobility. The Schengen area in Europe is the largest cross-border and transnational area in the world, where you don't need passport controls at the borders. It's a great achievement. I still remember when I was a young student, just 30 years ago, when I went for the very first time to visit other countries in Europe, leaving Greece to go up to the United Kingdom, when I went back home, I had to have my passport replaced because it was full of stamps. And one day, 30 years after, suddenly, Europe became our common, open, and hospitable home. In other words, it is one of the greatest achievements of European integration in the past 3 decades. But this wonderful freedom has come under threat, risk, because of irregular migration flows and recent terrorist attacks in Europe. Border security has become a major concern of our citizens in the European Union, something which I know is also shared by many American citizens here. I myself have been a proponent of better protected borders from the very outset, but not at any cost. We have to better manage and secure our borders, but this cannot come at the cost of our fundamental values of tolerance and openness. And believe me, it is a very fragile balance. We cannot and we shall never become a fortress Europe. It is far away from our philosophy and our historical experience. So the European Commission has taken a very firm position on that. Despite the pressure of populist movements. It is also true that 3 years ago, Europe was not prepared to deal comprehensively with the migration crisis and in parallel the continuous threat of terrorist attacks. Europe had no idea of how to cope with this situation. No experience at all. Only some member states like Germany, for instance, or Sweden. The rest of the European countries had an experience in sending migrants abroad. Hundreds of thousands of millions are here in the United States, in Canada, in Australia. But this unprecedented phenomenon brought to Europe in front of a very complicated and difficult situation. As politician, I was the very first one to cope with this reality. And without any exaggeration, I would tell you that I started from scratch. But we are not where we were 3 years ago, definitely. But during these 3 years, we had to do a lot. And believe me, it was not easy at all. Thanks to our common European efforts over the past 3 years, we are now much better equipped today to do this. Thanks to this hard work inside the European Union, but also outside the European Union, irregular arrivals to Europe today are almost 30% below the number of arrivals in the year 2014. This was a year before the migration crisis even started. A first important principle in our efforts so far has been that we need to know who is crossing our borders, and we need to be able to refuse entry more effectively to those who pose a threat and return those who have no right to stay in the European Union. Because the principle is very clear. The ones who are in need of international protection according to international law will have it. But all the ones who want to cross irregularly and illegally the European borders, they know that they will be sent back home. In Europe, something that was not the case in the beginning of the crisis, we have established so-called hotspots in countries like Italy and Greece, which are key control points for both migration and security. Because in the beginning, the situation was totally out of control. More than 1 million people managed to cross the European borders. And of course, it was almost impossible for the national defense system of these countries to block their route. That was against the basic principle of the Geneva Convention. Incoming migrants right now, that was not the case before, are registered, identified, fingerprinted, and checked against security databases. We have also created in the meantime, and believe me, it wasn't an easy thing. I call it my baby, because there were a lot of strong reactions on behalf of member states. So we created a truly European Borders and Coast Guard. Now more than 1,700 European Border and Coast Guards from all across Europe support the 100,000 national border guards of our common external European borders in place in regions like Greece, Italy, Bulgaria, and Spain. A rapid reaction pool of 1,500 border guards is also on standby in case of an emergency. So if something happens somewhere in Europe, in 24 hours, 1,500 people will be there to support the national border control authorities. Something that was not existing before. New security threats, such as the return of foreign terrorist fighters, also require thorough checks starting from our external perimeter. Since April, systematic controls take place at the external borders, so that every person entering the Schengen area is checked against all European databases. The use of our databases is growing exponentially. We want to complement existing information systems with new ones to close all gaps. Let me share you one of my experiences. Believe me, it was very difficult to convince member states to cooperate and exchange information. You know, the deep state in Europe is still strong. In the United States, sometimes you don't call it European Union, you call it a bloc. The real power is not in the hands of the Commission. We are supposed to be the executive institution, the government of Europe. But the real power is in the hands of the Council. The leaders, or at the ministerial level, represented by ministers. I have been myself from the other side of the table, and that I have repeatedly said to my colleagues there, so I know how do they think. Sometimes they do not think in a European way. They think in a national way. And this is a ground where nationalism, unfortunately, can find an open door to come back. Member States have recently agreed, finally, on our proposal for a system to record the entry and exit of all third country nationals crossing our external borders, allowing us, for example, to better track overstayers in the future. We will also soon have our European ESTA, which was not existing before. So we take best practice from the United States, because the United States have a great experience on migration, because this nation is made by migrants, legal and irregular migrants. I remind you that Silicon Valley did not start from an initiative of legal migrants, but of irregular migrants, who brought here their skills, their vision, their imagination, and they changed the world. So very soon, we shall have the European ESTA, we call it ETS, European Travel Information and Authorization System, which will carry out checks on all visa-free third country national travelers in order to detect those who might pose a security or migratory risk before they arrive, before they reach our borders. But it is not enough that we have all these information systems for borders, security, and migration. We also need to make sure that they are all interlinked and interconnected. This is why we have proposed at the end of last year to ensure the interoperability between all the European Union's information systems. And I'll go back to what I told before. The deep system still resists. Some of the countries in Europe, they have an old-fashioned way of thinking about national security. Yes, national security definitely is a national responsibility. But when you have to cope with migration and terrorism, they're both issues that transcend borders. And they have become global. The idea is that every bodyguard through the system, every visa, immigration, or police officer should have access to exactly the information they need when they need it. This, as you all understand, will be a game changer in the fight against terrorists hiding behind their identities. A second very important principle in our efforts has been our strengthened cooperation with third countries, our neighbors, and partners outside the European Union. We have stepped up our cooperation with Turkey, with the Western Balkans countries, and also with North and Sub-Saharan African countries. Thanks to our strengthened cooperation with Turkey, the arrivals in the Mediterranean, in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, in Greece have drastically dropped. Despite whatever is written and said in the media, this cooperation continues to work to this very day. It worked even during difficult political moments for Turkey, and I'm referring to the failed coup d'etat. Thanks to our cooperation across the Western Balkan countries, the Western Balkan region, we have much less irregular border crossings and less migrant smuggling, though we remain vigilant. Our work in and with Africa, including with our international partners, such as the United Nations and the African Union, has also made a real difference on the ground and in the central Mediterranean. Numbers have gone down there. For example, in the last 3 months, our help has enabled 15,000 migrants to return safely from Libya to their home countries. We supported the evacuation of more than 1,300 refugees from Libya for resettlement. I have asked all the member states of the European Union to help resettle at least another 50,000 refugees in the coming 2 years, including from Africa. So far, member states have already pledged for 40,000 places. I was, my dear friends, in Niger recently, only last week. And I had a stopover in Libya. I met there with Interior and Foreign Affairs ministers of countries of the European Union, the Sahel region, West Africa, and North Africa, as well as international partners as the United Nations, to discuss how to deepen and strengthen our cooperation in tackling migrant smuggling and trafficking in human beings. Because I want to be very clear on that. Smugglers and traffickers are worse enemies. we have declared a war against them. And we are determined to crack down on their networks because they are behind this phenomenon of our times. We have committed to strengthen our operational and judicial efforts in the region, but also to step up resettlements of the vulnerable people who are being evacuated from Libya to Niger. As you all understand, these are all very important steps. But they cannot happen alone, and they cannot happen ad hoc. This is precisely why we are investing so much in the international negotiations for the global compacts for migration and on refugees with the United Nations. My dear friends, migration is not only a European phenomenon. And 2 years ago, when I met with the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, in Brussels, I proposed, and he accepted, to hold an extraordinary General Assembly on migration in New York. And he did it. And at the same time, President Obama did something in parallel. A very important meeting. Leaders across the world met there, and they all accepted that we have to work together. Migration is not a regional, it's a global issue that needs global solutions. It is a global one, and it needs a global answer. This is why, and I want to be frank with you today, I deeply regret that the United States has pulled out of the global migration compact negotiations. I would expect exactly the opposite from the United States, because this great nation has a leading role to play on that. The United States cannot go back to the era of isolationism. It was its historical destiny to play a global role. And this global role is defined by all these noble principles that gave birth to this great nation. Migration will increasingly be an inherent feature of our times. The question is not how to stop it, but how to better manage it for everyone. And for this, we need everyone on board. The third principle of our efforts in the past 3 years has been fairness. This is very simple. Mindful of the essence of the Geneva Convention, those who are in need of protection should be helped in every way possible. But those, I repeat it, who do not have the right, those who abuse our hospitality, those who have no right to stay, they should be returned. And this had been said very clear to all our interlocutors from this region of the world. I want, however, to note that the American and European contexts in this regard are not the same. The situation of the many undocumented immigrants in the United States is something that we do not have at this scale in Europe. Europe advocates for a human migration and asylum policy system where people who apply for asylum but don't receive it should be returned as soon as possible. Now, we are reforming our asylum system so that decisions are issued quicker and that no applicants remain in limbo of irregularity. We are also urging and assisting our member states to become better at implementing and really enforcing return decisions. This mandate is given to the European Borders and Coast Guard, and they have already started implementing it in a very successful way. We are also stepping up our cooperation with key third countries when it comes to readmission agreements. There we have a problem. Some of these countries, it's not the moment to name them, but it sounds strange. They don't want to take their nationals back. They don't even recognize their nationals. But it happens. We have found the tools to convince them. And I'm going to be very frank with you. Even conditionality can be used for that. You know that the European Union is the main donor in terms of development of all these countries. We shall continue helping these countries to develop, but they have to take their part of responsibilities in managing irregular migration. And we have good examples, like Niger, for instance, where I was last week, and I get to praise and commend the government of Niger, the poorest country in the world, but a responsible country. It's not the case with the other countries in the Sahel region. In addition to what I said before, I have proposed recently a reform of our visa system to facilitate mobility for legitimate travelers, but at the same time beef it up to detect those who are not. We also want to use our visa policy as a leverage for countries that do not cooperate well with us on return and readmission. My dear friends, one thing is very clear. The global challenges of the day necessitate building and strengthening alliances and strong partnerships. The European Union and the United States are natural allies. We cannot turn a blind eye to all these problems, which touch all of us in an equal way. Our only way forward is together. And populism, I repeat, populism is not the answer. Populism is parochialism and opportunism that can lead only to negative, if not dangerous, outcomes. Whether in Europe or in the United States, our citizens want our societies to be safe, but they also want them to remain open and free, legally, physically, ethically, and socially, because they are democratic societies. And democratic values should be defended, protected, and upheld. The truth of the matter is that whether we talk about protecting our borders, increasing security, or better managing migration, we have to acknowledge that no country anymore can do it alone. Europe and the United States as I said before, have a long-standing history of cooperation. At times of instability and uncertainties, the world looks to us to show leadership and to continue safeguarding prosperity and stability across the globe with actions based on rules, principles, and values. We have a duty to continue working together to deliver these goals. This is why I wish to turn to the younger generations. The next generation that will inherit the transatlantic alliance and that will have to continue working for a better and safer world. You will agree with me that governments, administrations, elections, politicians come and go. But principles are there. And they will define the future of a new world under the circumstances I described before. But partnerships and alliances are built across generations, and they are shaped by the drive, ambitions, and openness of our youth. Because our youth today has taken all this achievement for granted. It was a gift of our generation to them. But they have a duty to carry out, to defend these values. Sometimes I say that Marx, I'm not a Marxist, had said that history repeats itself. No, it's a mistake. Men repeat history very simply because they don't read it. And this reminds me of the myth of Sisyphus from the Greek mythology. Someone condemned by gods to carry a heavy rock on his shoulders to the top of a hill, and when he was arriving there, the rock was rolling out again. Should we accept that it's the destiny of mankind? Of course not. We have a duty to carry out reading and drawing lessons from history. And this is the message to the younger generations. At a time where everything is a FaceTime call or a WhatsApp message away, where traveling to the other side of the world takes 2 days at most. Not here because I still suffer from jet lag, it's a bit long. Young people already know that our challenges are global. Because the younger people of today, they can be patriots and citizens of the world at the same time. This is a revolutionary development of our age. Ultimately, the choice between national and global is a false one. You know better than, unfortunately, many politicians today who are looking inwards instead of seeing the larger global picture in front of them, that you can maintain and develop your identity and your community, that you can even be, as I said before, patriot, whilst working together global endeavors and solutions in partnership and shared values with others. And the main issues to which I referred before mainly migration, global security has directly to do with that. We live in a global community. We are, most of everything, this includes our generation, citizens of the world, and let's work together to make this world better and work on these basic principles upon which our civilization is built, mainly solidarity, responsibility, and historical duty for the next generations. Thank you very much for your attention.
It's a great pleasure and honor to present to you this distinguished panel to respond and talk about Commissioner Avramopoulos' talk and the challenges at hand in Europe. Today's moderator is Lisa Benenson. She is Vice President of Communications and Strategy at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University Law School. And she previously served as Deputy Director of Communications at UNICEF. I'm delighted to present my dear friend, Professor Aristotle Tsampiris, who helped conceive this conference. He's chair of the Department of International and European Studies, professor of international relations at the University of Piraeus, which is the best in Greece. And in spite of his accent, he is Greek and not American. Okay? Even though he likes the Yankees, which is, I mean, that's his problem. He's published widely in the United States in outlets such as the Huffington Post and the New York Times. We are very honored to have with us also the remarkable Professor Catherine Fleming, a renowned and erudite historian of Greece and of theology. She is also provost of New York University and a professor at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, where she still publishes and leads major research teams. She has served as the president of the University of Piraeus in Greece, and she has what I consider to be one of the great honors of all time, which Patrick Leigh Fermor received as well. She has honorary Greek citizenship, and she was named, was it this year or last year, one of the Greeks of the Year. She's a very unusual and cosmopolitan person. So it's my pleasure to present this panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much and welcome, everyone. I'm curious if any of you in the audience have ever heard of the poet Warsan Shire. She's a British Somali woman who wrote a quite brilliant poem called Home, in which she writes, "Nobody leaves their home unless their home is the mouth of a shark." That has certainly been true for the millions of people fleeing persecution, poverty, war, and famine in the global south. And as you noted, Commissioner, there are today 65 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. As a former employee of UNICEF, I would like to add that half of those people are children who are vulnerable to violence, sexual abuse, and exploitation, who may not have access to the most basic kinds of health care or education. Ari, I'd like to turn to you first. Of the million refugees who landed on the shores of Greece and Italy since 2015, they're only a tiny percentage of the whole on the refugee crisis. Could you take us through some of the numbers here? Where are those refugees and migrants?
Thank you very much. First of all, very quickly, I'd like to thank Professor Jake Soll, Bob Strom, and the UNRWA Institute, Dean Amber Miller and Dornsife College, and of course, USC President Max Nikias. Now, I really like the fact that you asked me this question because I would like to remind everyone of John Adams, who, before he became the 2nd U.S. president, said, "Facts are stubborn things. So let's start with some facts and numbers. We live in an era of migration. In fact, we live in an era of refugees. The number of refugees today is estimated to be 21.3 million. That's the highest since World War II. The number of displaced people, that's 65.3 million. That's the highest ever. 87% of displaced people are not in Europe. They're in developing countries. 54% of refugees live in camps. And the average, we're doing facts, okay, in numbers. The average number of years of someone being designated as a refugee is 20 years. So this is not a good picture. In fact, the Commission estimated that at the highest point, maybe Europe will get 3 million refugees. The population of Europe, of the European Union, is about 500 million. That's less than 1%. You go to a country like Lebanon, 4.4 million population, 1.1 million refugees. We're doing numbers. Two more numbers I'd like to share with you. Okay? So the European Union, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, has erected 1,200 kilometers, that's 745 miles about, roughly, of fences and walls to keep out, to stem the flow of refugees and migrants, including my country, Greece. Bring us your poor, your huddled masses, not so much. Final fact. No matter how you define a refugee, there's no such thing as an illegal refugee, period. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gets me worked up.
Yes, that's a round of applause. Catherine, this isn't the first time these regions have been the scene of migration from the Global South. Can you talk to us a little bit about that history and what it means in terms of the challenges Europe faces today?
So historically, I would invoke, in the case of Greece and the southeastern Mediterranean, two other moments of great mass migration, forced migration, refugee crisis. One is the movement of tens of thousands of Jews out of Eastern European death camps toward Palestine after the liberation of the camps in 1944. There were many, many refugees who moved through Greece, regarded Greece as a point, in this case, not of entry to Europe as they regard it today, but as a point of getting the hell out of Europe, which they very badly wanted to do. There were over 50,000 Jewish refugees held in refugee camps in Cyprus for up to 4.5 years after the war. You could see signs that said from Dachau to Cyprus. So this is one historical moment that makes it clear that this part of the world is used to being either a point of entry or a point of departure for the mass movement of tens of thousands of human beings. And they dealt with it. The other moment that I'd like to invoke is the so-called population exchanges of 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne, which really just sort of ratified a reality on the ground rather than causing it, which was a reality in which about 1.3 million Asia Minor Greek Orthodox Christians were forcibly turned into refugees, and at the same time about 600,000 Muslims from Greece were forcibly turned into refugees when there was the execution of a population exchange agreement between the dregs of the Ottoman Empire, or the beginning of modern-day Turkey, and Greece. And again, this was dealt with. Now, when I say this was dealt with, what I want to point out is, although it feels that we're dealing with an unprecedented moment of refugee movement through the Greek peninsula, we're not. We've gone through two other ones over the course of the 20th century, and people rose to the occasion. People like Commissioner Avramopoulos are trying to get Europe to rise to the occasion again, but people shouldn't be deluded into thinking that the inability to rise to the occasion is created by anything other than political and human will.
So that's interesting. Let's all talk a little bit about it's been 3 years since the young Turkish Alan Kurdi, his tiny body washed up on a beach on the shore in Turkey, which shocked the world. I think that was the moment that the world started paying attention to the refugee crisis in the region. So can we talk a bit about what refugees are finding when they arrive on Greek and Italian shores and begin trying to make their way through Europe? All right, would you like to start?
Or
Commissioner, go ahead.
Commissioner.
Oh, yeah. Well, what had shaken the world was the body of this boy dead face down on the beach. Till that moment, the international public opinion was following what was happening, but it was this picture that shocked everybody and mobilized the global public opinion. As of that moment, things changed. And we have started working very hard within the European Union, first of all, to replace irregular channels by legal migration, because there was no legal migration policy in the past. The numbers of irregular arrivals have gone down, have decreased significantly. Around 2,500 irregularly in Europe in the year 2017 only in total. This is almost, as I said before, 30% less than in 2014, the year before the beginning of the crisis. In parallel, Europe has increased the number of resettlements. I'm sure you know what is the difference between relocation and resettlement. Relocation, when we relocate people from a member state of the European Union to another. Resettlement is when we open the doors of Europe for people out of Europe to be welcomed in Europe. And I gave you some numbers before, and believe me, I'm very optimistic because the numbers have gone down. Although some member states, unfortunately, from the very beginning, they were very reluctant in following and adopting this policy. I will be blunt with you. I would expect a more European stance on behalf of countries like Hungary and Czech Republic. They don't do so. Hungarians have forgotten that 500,000 of their compatriots in the year 1952 fled the country under the communist oppressive regime to come to Europe, and they found there a very hospitable and friendly environment, and they are there. Now the new leadership of this country has decided to erect walls to prevent people from coming. And recently, in view of the elections, they have articulated a very strong, a very harsh anti-migrants political verb. Other countries in the region are following. I don't want to remind you what leaders of these countries have said about migrants. They call them criminals. They say that they bring diseases in the country. Swords say that, but some of these people remind us what Nazis were saying before the Second World War and during the Second World War. This is not what Europe should do. That's why in my introductory remarks I refer to the lessons we have drawn from history. The asylum systems of many European countries have been pushed, it is true to say, to their limits by the arrivals of migrants in 2015. But countries like Sweden and Denmark and Germany, they send very, very clear message of what do we mean in Europe when we talk about solidarity. Maybe you don't know that, but solidarity is not just one more nice word. Solidarity is one of the basic principles upon which the European project is built after the Second World War. It is stipulated 17 times, it is enshrined in the founding text of the treaties. So solidarity, because of the migration crisis today, is in danger. And I will be blunt again. If solidarity as a principle collapses, this will mark the beginning of the end of the European Union. So, to finalize, the European Union wants to help them improve their reception conditions, speed up the procedures of the asylum applications, and support the integration of refugees, and we shall keep working that. But the very first signal came the day the body of a dead boy was found face down on the shores of Turkey. This sensitized and mobilized the public opinion.
So, Catherine Neri, can you talk a little bit about the situation on the ground? There are still thousands of refugees in camps on the Greek islands. What's the situation that they're finding there now?
I'll just say a few words about the situation in Lesbos on the island of Mytilene, where you have over 6,000 refugees being held in a facility that was designed to hold more like 1,800, living in conditions of unbelievable squalor. And if you interview people who are there, either working with NGOs or people who are living there, the phrase that you hear most frequently is, "This isn't Europe." It's really stunning the extent to which people living there had an idea of what it was they were coming to when they came to Europe, and how very, very disappointed they are by a reality that bears no resemblance to their imaginary version of what Europe would be like for them.
Can I add something on that?
All right, could we hear from you, and then that would be terrific, Commissioner.
Yeah, I have to say, I have to agree. 2 or 3 points I have to say. One is the idea in my country was not to have hundreds of thousands of refugees stay there, but help them just get out of Greece. There was one official, Greek official, he was interviewed by The Guardian, and he was asked, so what is your policy as regards refugees? And he had 3 words. Copy, you make a copy of their passport, print, fingerprint, Merkel, send them to Germany. And that was really, I represent no one here, so I feel more comfortable talking about these things. The policy was, with a country with 25% unemployment, you got to get people out of the country, not have them stay there. But the people who are staying there, the conditions are bad, and they're worst at the camp in Hungary. They're worse at Calais, France. I mean, this is the situation. This is Europe. This is not welcoming at all in any way. And let me tell everyone, this is not over. 11 days ago, 17 people drowned outside the Greek island of Agathonisi, including 5 kids. This is not over. So people are still coming, very fewer people, like Commissioner Avramopoulos said. And when they come to Europe, the detention centers are not great at all. And this is deeply, deeply troubling, especially when you keep in mind that the European Union is one of the 1 or 2 wealthiest parts of this globe.
Commissioner, you had something you wanted to add?
I referred before to the EU-Turkey statement, which was a great achievement. It is not an agreement according to international law, because if it were an agreement, then it had to be ratified by the national parliaments, and the European national parliaments were not in favor of that. So in the year 2016, the European Union issued a statement with Turkey, and this statement works. Now the question you raised before, what's the situation of the islands? Years ago there was nothing on the islands. More than 1 million people managed to cross the Aegean Sea. Hundreds of them died. The same happened in central Mediterranean. The number will never be accurate because most of these people, they were not registered, so they took the secret with them. But we managed to stop deaths in the sea. What happened just some days ago, it is something that made us all sad, but it couldn't be, unfortunately, prevented from happening. Right now, the numbers have gone down. 3 years ago, we had 14,000 crossings per day. Now the numbers have gone down to 50 to 60 persons per day.
True.
The Turks are delivering. But why there are still people on the islands? This is what I would like to clarify. Because one of the terms of these EU-Turkey statements foresees that the ones who are on the island have to be processed. I mean, their applications. And as I said before, these applications have to be processed very, very swiftly. That was not the case because of a delay caused by bureaucratic reasons at that time. So these poor people, they couldn't move forward because their applications were not processed. They were not granted the status of the asylum seeker, but they couldn't go back either. Although Turks were saying the ones who are rejected have to be sent back to Turkey, and then from here they go back to where they have to go. So this delay somehow led a number of approximately 60,000 people to live, sorry to say that, like prisoners, although they were not in detention centers on the islands. The situation has improved. Now the hotspots work properly. 90% of the ones who are entering Greece, and the same is in Italy, are fully registered, fingerprinted, identified. The processes are moving faster, and hopefully things will be much better in the months to come. But last year, the situation, especially during the winter time, was dire on the islands. So, yes, it was difficult to manage it in the beginning. Things are improving, but it's good to know that they are improving because the EU-Turkey statement works. In Italy now, where we have the so-called central Mediterranean route, the situation is still bad. And there we have Libya. I told before that I spent last week some hours in Libya and in Niger. Believe me, the situation in Libya is chaotic, is dire. We still have all these images coming from international media. The priority of the international community, if we really want to cope in an effective and successful way with this situation, is to exhaust all means we have in our hands to bring back stability in Libya. But it is very, very difficult.
Yes, it is.
Believe me. The country is divided. Just to give you an example, it's good to know from practical examples. When we arrived at the airport of Tripoli, in order to pick up the Minister of Interior of Libya to take him with us to Niger, it took 1 hour and a half for the minister to cross the 3 checkpoints out of the airport because militias are controlling the territory of Libya. And not only militias, but also smugglers, ruthless networks of smugglers that I said before we are determined to crack down on them.
So,
Italy is very supportive, other countries in the region, but believe me, the situation is not easy. We have to cope with a very difficult and dangerous situation.
yes, and clearly, even as we've managed to stop some of the flow of refugees into Europe, the underlying causes of people leaving their countries have not changed. They've gotten worse, if anything. Got it. They're giving us a little more time. I'm curious for all of you, even as the number of asylum seekers has come down, the toxic effect of this refugee crisis has continued to spread in terms of European politics. You raised Commissioner, the Czech president calling Muslim immigrants criminals, the head of Poland's governing party saying that they were riddled with disease, the leader of Hungary describes migrants as poison. Is it possible in this current political climate, Catherine, to come up with humane, responsible solutions for refugees?
I think it is, but I want to make another observation about history, which is not a pleasant one. The countries that are having the hardest time behaving in a humane or even recognizably human way, Hungary, Poland, Austria, well, less than 100 years ago, these are precisely the countries that had a very difficult time behaving in a humane or even human way in the face of another crisis, one of which they were in part the perpetrators. Countries like Greece that are on the front line right now of this refugee crisis, it's very difficult for me, not in an analogous sort of way, to look at the Greek experience of occupation during World War II, which produced incredible acts of humanity on the part of your average Greek. There were, of course, all sorts of people who collaborated or did horrible things, but on the whole, Greece behaved in a really remarkably dignified way to an extraordinarily difficult human circumstance, despite themselves being in very, very difficult waters. And they're doing exactly the same thing right now. So do I think that there are solutions? I do think there are solutions, but I think we would be making a big mistake if we fooled ourselves into thinking that what we're dealing with in Europe now is a whole new cast of characters thinking about crises in brand new ways. It seems depressingly clear to me that countries that didn't do a good job of dealing with people who were, quote, not like us, are continuing to do a very poor job of dealing with people who are, quote, not like us. And countries that historically, despite having their own tremendous problems, countries like Greece or even Italy, which was not on the right side in World War II, seem somehow to be dealing with things in a more humane fashion. And we might want to think a little bit about why that is so and take some lessons from that.
Ari, what about you?
Yeah, well, there are a couple things I absolutely have to say about this, but let me stress, we're talking about refugees. I don't think it's correct to think of them simply as victims, but also as important actors in this drama. Actors who are resourceful, brave, hard-working, focused, exactly the kind of people that demographically challenged Europe should have had or should have wanted to begin with. Situation today is actually not that great. The Atlantic Monthly, latest issue, Germany, great example, accepted 1 million refugees, population 83 million, 80% of them right now jobless. So obviously more has to be done on that front. And we're also talking about a situation, and here I'd like to, this is my opinion, but some people say, well, you know, but in reality, a lot of them, they're migrants. They're not refugees. They just want better jobs. You know what? The journey, the perilous journey, well documented, of rape, of all sorts of exploitation, turns, in my view, even migrants, economic migrants, into refugees. I mean, that is the sad reality. Europe is trying to do some things that are much better. And here, I'd like to say a few things on behalf of Commissioner Avramopoulos, who's actually been very modest. Let me give you an example. In 2015, 2016, the European Union states decided, let's do a relocation plan, okay? And out of the hundreds of thousands of refugees, let's do a little solidarity thing, 120,000. We'll do a little quota for each European member state. In the next fall, you know what? You will pay a fine. You will have to pay a price. We got to uphold solidarity, not in words, but in deeds. He's actually taking them to court. And we'll see what happens. I mean, this is Europe in the 21st century. We have to take fellow member states to court because they were willing to accept 0 out of a number that is, to begin with, in my view, a joke. Let me just, this is something that breaks my heart, but it has to do with you. So you mentioned in your speech that the states are the key actors in the EU, correct? And I was doing some research, and you actually had to send a communication to both the Parliament and the states concerning the condition of migrant children. I mean, the fact that you had to do that, and it's not automatic that we should think about kids that are migrants or refugees or in deep trouble and traveling solo many times alone is deeply, deeply troubling. So my point is there is hope because people are trying. Commissioner Avramopoulos is, in my view, I mean, I don't like simplistic views, good guys, bad guys, but in this case, facts talk for themselves. So, okay, I'll stop there.
Commissioner, I'm wondering if you, in looking at the landscape of Europe right now, do you see a leader, a country, who is capable or likely to seize the moral leadership here?
Well, in Europe, we do not try to find a country to lead us. Europe should take in the lead, and this is what we are doing right now. And Mr. Tsiabidis made a reference before to that. I will start by asking a rhetoric question. How it comes? In some former communist countries, they turned to become nationalist countries. They forgot all about their recent history, and they are inwards looking. Their politicians address their domestic audience. And more in Europe, political leaders, including leaders from the liberal and the Christian Democrat parties, conservative parties, instead of defending all these values, they change stance in order, by using populist and simplistic political verb, to be pleasant to the ears of the audience. So, this is a very, very negative message. The European Union, as I told you before, has taken the lead and puts everybody in front of their responsibilities, using all means we have in our possession. And we have the power, we have the means and the tools to convince them. One of these was mentioned before by Ari, when he said, yes, we have already launched infringement procedures. But is it a solution? Of course not. Europe is backtracking because of the migration crisis. And on the top of that, we had the security problems. People demand more safety, more security. And some are amalgamating terrorism with migration, which is not true. All the perpetrators of the terrorist acts on European soil were not migrants. We are homegrown people who turned their guns against their own homeland. So that's another issue, integration. Integration did not work. We have been working very hard recently in adopting an integration policy. And the signs are very, very positive, but we have to work very, very hard to make our societies more open. You mentioned before the statements made by European leaders. Words like immigrants are criminals. They say it. It's the president of the Czech Republic. The head of Poland's government's party has said refugees are riddled with disease. The leader of Hungary, let's hope he will change now because the elections are very close, because the day after a lot of politicians change their mind. You know how it is. Well, Austria's new far-right interior minister suggested concentrating migrants in asylum centers. It's far away from the democratic values of Europe. But I finish with that. We have always to take into consideration how do our citizens feel. As is the case here in the United States, also in Europe, the citizens are very much worried and concerned. But they are not ready to make any concessions as far as the democratic values are concerned. We have to address those fears. Our citizens want to feel safe, and we have to strengthen our security. But believe me, we do not intend to make any concession. The European leadership at all levels, the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker himself and the others, we are determined to walk on this line. And I'm sure that at the end, values and principles will prevail and our policy will be crowned by a great success. But we still live in a transitional period with what was said today. And the larger picture, yes, is not positive. We've made the progress, but we are not there yet.
Thank you, Commissioner. We want to take a few minutes to get 2 minutes. I can take 2 questions from the audience. Yes, right there. Should you speak up a little more? Here's their mic.
Good morning. My name is Tarius, and I work for the African Civil Rights Center. My question is actually for the Commissioner. I am a refugee. I came here almost 6 years ago. The problem of, the global migration and refugee crisis, we're not honest about, the root causes. And the Commissioner was, telling us, European countries or the European Union is really working hard to create a safe environment for refugees. That's not right. That's not true. Look at the U.S. and the European foreign policies. They are actually the root cause. These people are feeling their country. Myself, I was a judge in my country, and I was a human rights activist, and I left my country, Ethiopia, because of political oppression. And the government is being supported by the U.S. government and the European Union. And my question is, what has to be done in terms of European foreign policy, and then, of course, the American, foreign policy, because you see a lot of, militarization of, foreign policies, and these dictatorial regimes in different parts of Africa are, the root cause. And the root cause, again, is, those foreign policies in terms of, supporting
Thanks.
the...
Thanks. Shall we go ahead and address the question here? Let's take a second question right here. Thank you. And then what we'll do is we'll answer all of them. Ari, I'd like you to start, okay. And then we can work our way down the table.
And all stop.
And all keep it brief.
Thank you. My name is Steve Hindle from the Huntington Library. I'd like to pick up on the comment that the Commissioner made in closing about the obligation that European leaders have to face and address the concerns of their citizens about these issues. Why has there been such systematic failure on that initiative? The most obvious example is what happened in the United Kingdom leading to the Brexit vote. Why has there not been a sensible, rational debate within the European Union, both about the moral obligation to entertain and be hospitable to refugees, but also about the economic benefits of immigration?
Good.
So let's just note the 2 questions on the table are the question about systematic failure in the European Union, and additionally needing to address root causes, correct? So let's start with Ari and work
Commissioner
Commissioner, you want to go ahead? Okay.
Yes. Let me start from the second question. In our policy, I mentioned before integration. During the last 3 years, we worked in order to adopt something similar like a green card you have here in the United States. We call it a blue card. There are still some countries who resist, but this is the only way forward. We open legal pathways for the ones who want to come to Europe, and Europe will be in need of migrants in the future. Europe is an aging continent, demographically, and according to studies we have in our hands, in 10 years from now, Europe will be in need of approximately 1 million migrants. So we are preparing the ground for them. We want skillful migrants, and there are so many, especially from countries like Syria, who can be very helpful to the European economy. And then, when the moment comes, they can go back to contribute in the development of their own countries. So this is something that was not happening before. but it happens now. So legal pathways, legal migration, and blue card, it is part of our policy in the framework of integration. So I fully agree with you that we must work on that. As far as the first question is concerned, you talk about the foreign policy of the European Union. You know, there's a big difference between foreign policy of the United States and the foreign policy in the European Union. Foreign policy in the European Union is a national responsibility. Federica Mogherini is responsible on our behalf for our foreign policy. And our foreign policy is very, very clear, fully aligned to what I told you in the beginning as far as migrants are concerned. We have deployed a very, very clear strategy on that. That's why we have been traveling to all countries in the region, using, as I said before, also development leverages, but at the same time providing these governments with our support in how to better manage the situation on the ground. I mentioned some countries before. Some countries are very keen to work with us. Some others no, because the situation within these countries is still unstable. I'll tell you something that sounds a bit strange. I agreed with a country, I don't want to mention the name right now, that they will start taking back their nationals. But you know what they told me behind closed doors? We'll do it, but don't go public, because we have problem in the country. And don't forget that in the Sahel region, also from Western to Eastern Africa, the situation is very, very unstable. You know that the main root causes of all these people who flee their country is persecution, civil war, terrorism. Boko Haram is terrorizing the people, and the very, very powerful smugglers network who exploit all these desperate people. So we have to cope also with that. But our foreign policy is defined by one and very clear objective and goal: how to work together at an international level in order to bring back stability in the region. I want to be, again, blunt with you. I think a mistake was made some years ago when a very naive decision was taken to export democracy in some of these countries. What happened in countries like Europe, and it took 400 years, we tried to impose it there in 4 months. It was one of the reasons. I remember I was still foreign minister of my country in this council that decided to move towards the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya. Yes, Gaddafi was a dictator. Yes, Libyans deserve democracy. But what was the mistake at that time? They couldn't understand the culture, the political culture of these people. The day after, they would look for a new Gaddafi. In Egypt, for a new Mubarak. And in other countries, the same. Because democracy as a culture, not as a system, needs time.
Thanks, Commissioner. We are right up on it. I'm going to give each of my other panelists 1 minute each. They promised to keep it short. You want to go first, Ari?
Yes, thank you. I want to say that European states remain democratic, and hence the mindset of the people is very important. You started this session by talking about The Mouth of the Shark, a poem, and I need less than a minute to just read some other lines by a Greek poet. So that's Cavafy, My Heritage, and the poem, it's only 3 lines. Walls. Without pity. I mean, this was written in the 19th century, early 20th century, but listen to this. Without pity, without shame, without consideration, they build around me enormous towering walls. And I sit here now in growing desperation. This fate consumes my mind. I think of nothing else. But no noise, no sound from the builders did I hear. Imperceptibly, they shut me off from the world without. Folks, we got to make some noise and wake up European citizens. So this is very important what we're doing here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. Catherine, close us out.
Well, so we're having a poetry slam. I'll give us a little poetry, too. Two things that I want to say. One is we should note that we haven't really touched on the causes of the refugee crisis very much, and there's a huge amount of guilt that can go around starting in this country, and perhaps we can have a follow-up event and talk about that. But the thing I want to say in conclusion actually has to do with sentiment and emotions. Much of the way in which this crisis is being responded to rests not on logic, but on feelings. Take, for instance, the Trump discourse about building a wall. Well, last year, more Mexicans left the United States to go to Mexico than left Mexico to come to the United States. But that empirical fact, unfortunately, has zero impact on a political mode that is primarily emotional. And the emotional aspect of this, to which I'll bring a poem, also a Greek poem, is the current zeitgeist of tremendous nostalgia for a past European moment when it is so imagined, countries stuck to themselves, there were baguettes in France, so on and so forth. And the past, as they say, isn't what it used to be. And there's a great poem, also Greek, this one by George Seferis, «Η νοσταλγία σου έχει πλάσει μια χώρα ανύπαρκτη». Your nostalgia has created a non-existent country. So with that, I'd like to close the session.
Thank you.
When poetry is mixed with politics, it creates a dream.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Commissioner Avramopoulos, and many thanks to the panel. Great job. We're going to start again in 5 minutes. Coffee outside, water.